Delete her access, Richard Cole said, his voice cutting through the glass boardroom like a clean line across polished steel. And just like that, the quiet hum of laptops and whispered side conversations collapsed into a stillness so sharp it felt deliberate, rehearsed, as if everyone in that 42nd floor conference room had been waiting for a moment like this to land. Ava Brooks didn't move, not when the command left his mouth, not when two members of IT hesitated near the door, unsure if they should actually step in, and not when a few executives exchanged glances that said this had gone too far, but no one would say it out loud. She stood beside the long walnut table, a tablet still warm in her hands, her reflection faintly visible in the floor-to-ceiling glass behind her, where the skyline stretched out in clean lines and distant traffic, the kind of view people like Richard used as proof they had made it. That strategy isn't yours, she had said less than 10 seconds earlier, her voice calm, almost too calm for the weight of the words, and the sentence still lingered in the air, unfinished, like something the room itself hadn't decided how to process. Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of micro-expression that never made it into press photos or investor calls, and he let out a small breath through his nose, something between a laugh and a dismissal, before turning back toward the massive screen at the front of the room where the presentation sat frozen on slide 12, a clean, confident title stamped across the top. Expansion Model Q4. You're an assistant, he said without looking at her now, his tone smooth again, controlled, practiced, not a strategist. And a few people shifted in their seats, one man adjusting his cufflinks, another pretending to review numbers on his tablet. The room trying to return to normal even as the tension held tight, like a wire pulled too far. Ava's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of her tablet, not trembling, not retreating, just steady, and her eyes moved once more to the screen, to the small corner detail most people ignored, a thin line of metadata that flickered faintly under the overhead lights, something she recognized instantly because she had written it once, years ago, in a different office, under a different name that no longer existed. The air conditioning hummed softly, cool against the back of her neck, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne, and for a moment no one spoke, no one moved. The entire room suspended between command and consequence, between what had just been said and what it meant, and Richard, still facing forward, tapped his pen. Once against the table, a sharp, precise sound that echoed just enough to break the silence, signaling the meeting would continue, that this interruption would be erased, that she would be erased with it. But the screen didn't change, the slide didn't advance, and in that quiet, almost invisible corner, something waited to be seen. The pen in Richard Cole's hand did not move again, hovering just above the table as if even the smallest motion might disturb something fragile now settling in the room. And Ava Brooks remained exactly where she was, neither stepping back nor forward, her posture quiet but unyielding, the kind of stillness that did not ask for permission to exist. Around them, the executives shifted in subtle, almost invisible ways, a chair rolling half an inch, a breath drawn a little too sharply, a glance exchanged and quickly withdrawn, each person aware that something had shifted but unsure where to place it, unsure whether to look at the screen or at her, because looking at her meant acknowledging that she had spoken into a space where voices like hers were not expected to land. The overhead lights reflected off the glass wall behind Richard, turning the skyline into a pale blur. And for a brief second his reflection overlapped with the presentation slide, his silhouette cutting across the clean lines of the model he had been about to present to investors in less than an hour, a model he had rehearsed, refined, claimed. Ava's eyes moved again, not to him, but to that small line at the bottom of the screen, the metadata that most people ignored because it looked technical, irrelevant, invisible. But to her it was a signature written in a language only she could read without effort, and she could almost feel the memory of it. Late nights under dim lighting, a second-hand laptop humming softly, a space no larger than a one-bedroom apartment where ideas had been built not for recognition but for survival. "We are moving on," Richard said finally, his voice regaining its rhythm, measured and controlled, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief glitch. And he tapped the remote in his hand, expecting the slide to change, expecting the Room to follow him back into the version of reality he had already decided was true. But the slide did not change, the system lagging for a fraction of a second too long. And in that delay, the detail remained visible, steady, undeniable, and one of the analysts at the far end of the table leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing just enough to focus, as if something about that small line had begun to register. Ava inhaled slowly, the air cool and dry, and for a moment she considered stepping away, letting the moment dissolve, because she knew exactly how easily it could disappear if she allowed it. How quickly rooms like this reset themselves when challenged, but something deeper held her in place, not defiance, not anger, just a quiet refusal to vanish. Richard's thumb pressed the remote again, a little firmer this time, and the faint crease between his brows deepened by a degree so small it would go unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years reading expressions that were never meant to be read, and his gaze flickered down, just briefly, just enough to catch the same line she had seen, the same name, the same timestamp, and for the first time since she had spoken, his attention was not on the room, not on control, but on the possibility that something in front of him did not belong to him at all. Richard Cole did not speak right away, and that silence, more than anything he had said before, unsettled the room because it was not part of the rhythm they knew, not part of the controlled cadence that had built his reputation. His eyes stayed on the lower corner of the screen now, no longer scanning the headline figures or the projected growth curves, but fixed on that thin line of text that had somehow become heavier than the entire presentation, and his fingers, still holding the remote, loosened just slightly as if the object had lost its purpose. Ava Brooks felt the shift before anyone else did, not because it was obvious, but because she had lived inside moments like this before, the exact point where certainty begins to fracture, where confidence does not collapse, but starts asking questions it never had to ask. One of the senior analysts cleared his throat, softly, not to interrupt, but to ground himself, and another executive leaned closer to the table, eyes narrowing as if trying to confirm what he thought he saw. The room slowly, quietly reorienting itself around something no one had planned for. Richard took a single step closer to the screen, not enough to draw attention, just enough to read the detail more clearly, and the overhead lights caught the side of his face, highlighting the faint tension along his jaw, the kind that never appeared in interviews or earnings calls, the kind that only surfaced when control slipped by a fraction. "Who prepared this file?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, and for a moment no one answered, not because they did not know, but because the question itself had changed meaning, no longer procedural, no longer routine. Ava did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if she understood that the weight of the moment did not come from speaking quickly but from allowing the truth to exist long enough to be seen. The city outside moved as it always did, cars threading through streets far below, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, completely unaware that inside this room, a narrative carefully constructed over years was beginning to shift. Richard's eyes flicked once toward Ava, just briefly, as if recalibrating, as if seeing her not as a position or a title, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and then back to the screen. Again, to the timestamp, to the name, to the year that aligned too precisely with the earliest phase of his company's rise. The connection was not fully formed yet, but it was there, hovering, pressing at the edge of his awareness, and the more he looked, the less the model in front of him felt like something he owned completely. Ava finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without forcing its way there. And in that moment, no one moved, no one interrupted, because whatever came next was no longer about hierarchy or roles. It was about something far more difficult to ignore. Ava Brooks let the silence stretch for one more breath before she spoke, her voice steady and unhurried. "I prepared the original model," and the words did not land like a challenge, but like something factual, something that had existed long before this room decided what to believe, and a few heads turned fully toward her now, no longer pretending to stay neutral, because the tone she used carried no hesitation, no attempt to defend, only clarity. Richard Cole's grip tightened slightly around the remote again, not out of anger, but out of something less familiar, something closer to recalculation, and he glanced once more at the timestamp, at the name, then back at her, his gaze sharper now, searching for inconsistency, for anything that would restore the balance he understood. That model was acquired with a defunct startup, he said, each word measured, as if placing them carefully would anchor the narrative back into place, 5 years ago. And there was a quiet confidence in that statement, a reminder of due diligence, of contracts, of processes that validated ownership. Ava nodded once, a small movement, almost respectful, and her eyes did not leave his. Yes, she said. It was, and for a second the agreement seemed to ease the tension, as if the room had found a path back to normal. But then she continued, her voice unchanged. I built it before it was acquired. And the sentence settled differently, heavier, because it did not oppose him directly. It simply extended the truth beyond the version he had been holding. The air felt cooler somehow, or maybe the awareness of it sharpened, and one of the executives leaned back slowly, the leather chair making a soft sound against the floor, as if creating distance from the center of the moment. Richard's expression did not shift dramatically, but the pause that followed stretched longer than expected, and he stepped closer to the screen again, this time not to present, not to lead, but to examine, his eyes tracing the structure of the model, the layered logic, the sequencing that had once impressed investors and analysts alike, and now, seen through a different lens, it carried a new question he had never asked. That company filed for bankruptcy, he said, quieter now, less certain, and Ava's gaze softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition of the memory behind the statement. It did, she replied, and for a brief moment something unspoken passed through her posture, a weight that had nothing to do with this room and everything to do with the years before it. The skyline outside remained bright, unchanged, but inside, the room had shifted entirely, no longer structured around authority, but around a truth slowly surfacing, piece by piece. And Richard's attention moved once more to the lower corner of the screen, to the name that had been invisible until it was not. And this time he did not look away quickly. This time he stayed with it, as if the longer he looked, the more the past aligned with the present in ways he could no longer ignore. And for the first time since the meeting began, he did not reach for control, he reached for understanding, even if he did not yet know what it would cost him. The word bankruptcy did not echo loudly in the room, but it settled into every corner like a weight that no one could shift, and Ava Brooks felt it the same way she had felt it years ago, not as a failure, but as a moment the world had already judged without asking who had built what before it collapsed. Her hands rested lightly against the edge of the table now, fingertips barely touching the polished surface, grounding herself in the present while the past moved quietly beneath it. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same steady clarity. The model was complete before the company failed, and she did not raise her tone, did not push the words forward, because she understood that truth did not need volume when it was already aligned with evidence. Richard Cole exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and his eyes traced the structure of the slide again, the sequencing of decisions, the branching paths that had once impressed him enough to invest, enough to acquire, enough to build an entire narrative around. And now each layer seemed to shift slightly under a new context, as if the foundation he had accepted without question was revealing edges he had never examined. One of the board members leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, eyes moving between Ava and the screen, and for the first time someone else spoke, not to challenge, but to clarify. You are saying you designed this before the acquisition, and Ava turned her head slightly, acknowledging the question with a small nod. Yes, she said. It was part of a proposal we submitted before we ran out of funding. And the simplicity of her explanation carried more weight than any defense could have, because it fit too cleanly into the timeline now forming in everyone's mind. Richard's fingers tapped once against the remote again, a habit more than a decision, and he glanced toward the analytics panel embedded in the slide, recognizing patterns he had always credited to his leadership, his intuition, his risk tolerance. And now those same patterns felt less like instincts and more like something inherited, something adopted without fully understanding its origin. Why were you not retained? He asked, the question sharper than the last, not aggressive, but edged with something closer to urgency. And Ava held his gaze without hesitation. Because when the company was acquired, they kept the assets, not the people. And the sentence landed with a quiet finality that no one in the room could easily dismiss, because it was a process they all understood, a process they had all benefited from in one way or another. The air in the room seemed to thin, the hum of the building more noticeable now, the distant sound of traffic far below threading through the silence. And Richard's posture shifted, just slightly, his shoulders no longer squared in the same way, his stance no longer centered at the head of the table but somewhere beside it, as if the position he had occupied minutes ago no longer fit with the information in front of him. Ava did not move, did not step forward to claim anything, and that absence of demand made her presence stronger, because it removed any doubt about her intention. She was not trying to take something, she was simply allowing the truth to be seen. Richard's eyes returned once more to the lower corner of the screen, to the name, to the timestamp, to the year that had once marked the beginning of his success story. And now, piece by piece, it was becoming something else entirely, something he had not built alone, something he had never fully understood until this moment. And the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, pressing against everything he thought he knew, until the only thing left was a question he could no longer ignore. The question did not leave Richard Cole's mind. It stayed there, circling, pressing against the edges of everything he had built. And for a moment he did not speak again, not because he lacked authority, but because the words he would normally use no longer fit the shape of the situation unfolding in front of him. The room responded to that silence in subtle ways, a shift in posture, a glance held a second longer than usual, the quiet awareness that something important was happening without anyone announcing it. And Ava Brooks stood within that stillness, not claiming space, not retreating from it, simply existing in it with a kind of calm that did not seek validation. The light from the windows had shifted slightly, casting a softer reflection across the table, and the screen at the front of the room remained unchanged, the same model, the same structure, but now it carried a different weight, as if every line of it had gained a history that no one could unsee. Richard lowered the remote slowly onto the table, the small sound of plastic against wood marking a change that no presentation slide ever could, and he placed both hands lightly on the edge of the surface, leaning forward just enough to study the details again, not as a leader presenting, but as someone trying to understand what had always been there. His eyes moved through the architecture of the model, the decision trees, the calculated risks, the projections that had once felt like his instinct sharpened into strategy, and now they felt different. Not incorrect, not flawed, but rooted somewhere beyond him. And the realization did not strike like a sudden shock. It settled gradually, like a truth that had always existed but had never been given the space to surface. Ava's gaze softened slightly as she watched him, not with expectation, not with triumph, but with a quiet recognition of what it takes to see something you were not prepared to see. And her hands relaxed at her sides, no longer braced against the table, as if the moment itself no longer required her to hold it in place. One of the executives shifted in his chair, the faint creak of leather breaking the silence just enough to remind everyone that they were still in a meeting, still in a room governed by hierarchy and outcomes. And yet those structures felt less rigid now, less certain, because the foundation beneath them had been questioned in a way no one had anticipated. Richard straightened slightly, his posture no longer as rigid as before, and his eyes moved from the screen back to Ava, holding there for a moment longer than before, not dismissive, not skeptical, but searching, recalibrating, and for the first time there was no immediate response, no attempt to regain control of the narrative, only a pause that allowed the truth to exist fully between them. The city outside continued its rhythm, sunlight gliding across distant buildings, cars moving through intersections, life carrying on without interruption. And inside, the room felt suspended, as if time had slowed just enough for everyone to witness the exact point where perception shifts into understanding, and nothing needed to be said for that shift to be real, because it was already happening, quietly, undeniably, in the space between what had been believed and what was now being seen. Richard Cole's gaze did not break from Ava Brooks this time, and the longer he looked, the more the room seemed to fall away, the polished table, the glass walls, the quiet presence of executives who had once mirrored his certainty, all fading into something secondary to the realization forming in front of him. His mind moved quickly now, not with the confidence of control, but with the urgency of reconstruction, tracing timelines, acquisitions, the quiet absorption of a small company that had barely registered beyond a line item in a quarterly report. And yet that single acquisition had become the backbone of everything that followed. He could see it now, not as a distant memory, but as a sequence of decisions that had felt effortless at the time. The model already refined, already structured, already capable of scaling, and he had stepped into it, expanded it, presented it as vision, never once questioning where that clarity had originated. The weight of that understanding settled into his posture, not heavy enough to break him, but enough to shift him, and his shoulders lowered slightly, the rigid certainty that had defined him moments ago no longer holding in. The same way, one of the board members leaned forward again, this time more openly, eyes fixed on Ava, not with skepticism, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if the narrative had already begun to change in his mind. Ava remained still, her presence grounded, her expression unchanged, not pressing the moment, not amplifying it, simply allowing the truth to occupy the space it had been denied before. And that restraint carried more power than any argument could have. Richard turned his attention back to the screen one more time, but this time he did not look at the projections or the numbers. He looked at the structure itself, the logic behind it, and for the first time he saw it not as something he had created, but as something he had inherited, something he had built upon without understanding its origin. And that distinction, small as it seemed, changed everything. His hand moved away from the table slowly, no longer gripping the edge, no longer anchoring himself in authority, and he took a step back, creating a subtle distance between himself and the position he had occupied at the head of the room. And that movement, though small, did not go unnoticed, because it marked a shift that no words had yet defined. The air in the room felt different now, not tense, not confrontational, but suspended, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would not easily be reversed. And no one spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that the next words would carry a weight that could not be undone. Richard finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge, not weakened, but changed. The foundation, he said, almost to himself, as if testing the truth of it before allowing it to fully exist, and his eyes lifted again to meet Ava's, holding there, not with dismissal, not with doubt, but with a clarity that had not been there before, because in that moment, the story he had told himself for years was no longer complete, and the person standing in front of him was no longer invisible. Richard Cole did not look away when the words settled between them, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no trace of dismissal left in his expression, only a quiet recognition that had taken shape too clearly to ignore. His posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal something deeper than authority adjusting. It was perspective, and he let his hands fall naturally to his sides, no longer gripping the table, no longer anchoring himself in the role he had always occupied. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed, no longer tense, no longer uncertain. Now it carried a kind of weight that came from understanding, the kind that made people sit still not out of fear, but out of respect for what was unfolding. Richard took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and the center of the room, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, stripped of performance. "I built this company on that model," he said, not as a declaration, but as a realization spoken aloud, and his eyes moved briefly to the screen, then back to Ava, holding there as if recalibrating everything he thought he knew. Ava did not respond immediately, her expression calm, her shoulders relaxed, and there was no expectation in her stance, no demand for acknowledgement, only a quiet presence that allowed the truth to exist without pressure. One of the executives shifted again, this time more openly, as if the shift in Richard had given permission for the room itself to breathe differently. And another leaned back, eyes no longer scanning reports but focused entirely on the exchange unfolding in front of them. Richard's gaze softened slightly, not in weakness, but in clarity, and he exhaled once, a controlled breath. that carried something unspoken with it. And I never knew where it came from. He continued. The admission simple, direct, and heavier than any defense could have been, because it dismantled the certainty he had stood on just minutes before. The overhead lights reflected faintly across the glass walls, the skyline still stretching endlessly beyond, unchanged by what was happening inside. But within the room, the shift was undeniable, no longer about who held power, but about who held truth. Ava's eyes met his without hesitation, steady and grounded, and there was no trace of resentment in them, no attempt to reclaim something or prove something. Only the quiet strength of someone who had already accepted her own story long before anyone else recognized it. Richard straightened slightly, not returning to his former stance, but settling into something new, something less rigid. And for a brief moment he glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of the people who had followed his leadership, who had believed in his narrative, and then back to Ava again, as if acknowledging that the story in this room was no longer his alone to define. The air felt lighter now, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had transformed into something clearer, something that no longer needed to be resisted, and Richard's voice, when it came again, carried a different tone entirely, not authority, not command, but something closer to respect, still forming, still unfamiliar, but real. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer measured in roles or titles, but in the space between what had been unseen and what was now fully visible. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the moment no longer belonged to words. It belonged to what had already been understood, and Ava Brooks felt it in the stillness, the kind that settles after something real has surfaced, when nothing needs to be forced into meaning, because the meaning is already there. Richard Cole stood there without reaching for the screen, without adjusting the presentation, without trying to recover the version of control he had carried into the room, and instead his attention remained where it had shifted, steady on her, not as an assistant, not as a role defined by hierarchy, but as someone whose presence had rewritten the foundation of everything he had believed about his own success. The executives around the table did not interrupt, did not redirect, because they could feel it too, the quiet reordering of perspective, the subtle but undeniable shift from assumption to recognition, and it held them in place more firmly than any directive ever could. Ava exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried no longer needing to be held in the same way, and her shoulders relaxed just enough to signal that the moment did not require anything further from her, not defense, not explanation, not even acknowledgement, because she had already done what mattered. She had allowed the truth to exist. Richard's gaze softened again, not out of uncertainty, but out of clarity, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to the room, not to the screen, but to her, an acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken to be real. And in that quiet gesture, something closed, not as an ending, but as a recognition finally aligned with reality. The screen remained unchanged behind them. The model still displayed in its clean, structured form, but now it carried a different weight, no longer a symbol of one man's vision, but a reflection of something deeper, something that had existed before it was ever seen, and would continue to exist beyond the room it now filled. Ava turned slightly, her movement unhurried, and began to step away from the table, not as someone dismissed, not as someone retreating, but as someone who no longer needed to stand in place to be recognized. And the quiet sound of her footsteps across the polished floor marked the only movement in the room. The sunlight through the glass shifted again, catching the edge of the table,